Hey, what's going on, my friend? It's Jeff Newport from ChasingStrength.com. And in today's video, we are answering the question, is your desk job stealing your strength? In case you didn't know, desk jobs or any chair surfing is what I call a necessary evil in our modern lifestyle. Okay, so on the upside, we now have the ability to concentrate for long periods of time and bring home the bacon in relative comfort without sweating in the fields or the foundries, right? Now, on the downside, all that sitting tightens you up and destroys our posture. So we end up with what we call a forward head position like this, slumped shoulders like this, and tight hips. These are three major recipes for disaster when hoisting your kettlebells over your head. Okay, so why? Well, a forward head position, that decreases your breathing ability and therefore creates a loss of core stabilization or core stability through what we call diaphragm or diaphragmatic inhibition. Slumped shoulders, well, that causes the inability for you to fully put your arms over your head, increasing the risk of injury to your shoulders during your presses or your snatches. And tight hips, well, they cause excessive stress and shear forces on your lumbar spine, which is your lower back, right, from tight hip flexors and the resulting weak glutes. Okay. Now, as a result, you may not be able to use your hips on swings, so you feel your lower back overworking instead. Everybody's favorite injury, right? So one of the common fixes, right, and I say fixes, I use air quotes, fixes like we like to use on this channel for tight hips is stretching your hip flexors, which is the front of your hips. Now, when I first discovered this back in 2001, 2002, I was amazed at how awesome I felt until I didn't. See, even though my hip flexors loosened up, they didn't stay that way. They didn't stay loose. The new ranges of motion I had suddenly unlocked, well, it never stuck around. Now, why is that, right? Why didn't they stay, or why didn't the range of motion, stay? Well, the research shows that while hip flexor stretching temporarily increases your deep abdominal transversus abdominis activity, right? That's one of the deep abdominal stabilizers, transversus abdominis, or transverse abdominis, excuse me. It doesn't stay that way. It returns to muted, right? Put air quotes around that, muted, right? When your training is over. Now, furthermore, the sitting continually reinforces the tightness you feel in the front of your hips, and the tightness you get in the front of your hips, and that creates a negative feedback loop. That's not all. Here's what else. At the same time I was stretching my hip flexors, I was using a core stabilization strategy called abdominal bracing. Now, that too worked great until it didn't. Now, why not? Well, it turns out that a hard abdominal brace actually increases the forces your hip joints have to absorb. These are called ground reaction forces, and that means they actually have to work harder than normal. Furthermore, the research shows that cranking up that brace style, right? Think of it as a knob, right? Remember that old beatbox that we used to have? Boombox, excuse me. Man, I'm showing my age. The boomboxes we used to have, they had all the knobs and dials on there. Think about turning that brace style as a knob all the way up, right? That shifts part of the load that's meant to spare your spine, your lumbar spine. It shifts it forward straight into your hip sockets. Okay. And I got to tell you, I was a master at the hard brace. Okay. So why is this a problem? Well, the research also shows, there's a research called finite element modeling. It shows that a hard brace, although it does increase intra-abdominal pressure, which is the purpose of the brace, right? And it also drops the shear forces at the L4, L5, right, joints in your spine or your lower back. It actually spikes the hip joint compression by about 8 to 12%. And that, let's just say you do about 10 to 12 reps there. Well, you've increased that compression on your hip joints by about 100%. Now keep doing that over the course of time. Okay. And then you have some pretty severe problems, or at least you have the potential for some pretty severe problems. Now, another study called the landing study shows that bracing, that hard abdominal brace, cuts your hip knee flexion, or the bending that occurs simultaneously at your hips and your knees, and jacks up or increases your ground reaction forces. So now your hip joints take that hit, right, of that force instead of your glutes, right? That's what your glutes are designed for. They're designed to absorb that force. So add those extra pounds of force to hips that are already glued short by a chair, and the recipe for disaster looks like this, or at least the recipe for potential disaster looks like this. Tight hip flexors plus sleepy glutes that don't work plus a max brace equals your back still aches and your hips start to bark at you or even pinch right there in the front of the hip joint. And I am 99.99% sure that's exactly what happened to me and my hips and how I tore both hip labrums, my right one in January of 2005 and my left one in September of 2005. Even after 4 hard years of obsessive, multiple times a day hip flexor stretching and hard, heavy bracing on practically every lift that I did. So you might be wondering, that's great, Jeff. Thanks for giving us that background. But what is the fix here? How do I fix this? Now, it's pretty simple, kind of simple. And that is we need to restore what's called anticipatory control. What is that in plain English, please? Okay, I'm getting there. So look, before a healthy body moves, an arm, leg, or kettlebell, the deep core musculature is designed to fire reflexively first, about 30 to 50 milliseconds early, okay? Researchers call that tiny head start feed-forward activation or anticipatory postural control, right? Or anticipatory postural adjustment. Okay, rehab folks call it reflexive stabilization or reflexive stability. It's the same thing. It's just using a different label. Okay, there's a classic study done. I'll leave the link below in the video description. And it showed that the transverse abdominis and the multifidus is also another deep core stabilizer. Those two muscles fired before the shoulder, what's called the deltoid, right, in pain-free lifters, but it fired late in people who had lower back pain. Now, you might be wondering, yeah, but I can lock in that brace. Sure, you can lock in the brace before the first rep, but once your kettlebell is flying, you've only got milliseconds at each hinge in each catch, right, in order to create that deep abdominal stabilization. So if your deep core reflexes are on snooze, right, then conscious bracing, right, that hard brace can't rearm the core stabilization mechanism fast enough. So shear forces creep back in just when the forces peak, okay? And that is why some people hurt their backs on the top of the swing, right, or at the very bottom of the backswing. That anticipatory control isn't there to protect the shear forces on the lumbar spine in either one of those end ranges. So as a result, the spine can move when it's not designed to, and you get that lightning shock. If you've had that, that's really exciting, isn't it? I have. Super awesome. Or that sharp pinch right there in the lower back, right? Usually that sharp pinch is right in the middle or on either side of the spine. I've had all of them. They're exciting. I love them. Now, fortunately, I haven't had them using kettlebells, but using barbells, okay? So you might be wondering, how do we restore that anticipatory control? Well, great question. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to reinstall that feed-forward activation through specialized stability exercises. Now, if you watched the last video, and we'll leave a link in the video description below, you'll know that I recommend starting with diaphragmatic breathing. From there, one of my favorites, all right, is called the dead bug. Research shows that it's one of the top exercises for restoring anticipatory control. There are several others we use in the stability section of what I call the SSP model. SSP stands for stability, strength, and power. And that's found inside systematic core training, okay? And what you're going to do is you simply perform 5 minutes of stability training before each kettlebell session. And then 10 to 15 minutes, if you like, at least 10 minutes after your kettlebell training session is over. And then once you have completed all the stability exercises and checked all those boxes in the stability portion of the program, then you're going to move on to the strength portion and do the same thing there. And then from there, you're going to move on to the power portion. Okay. Now, I've outlined in detail inside systematic core training for kettlebells this entire process. If you're interested in it, and it includes videos demonstrating how to perform each exercise. I'll leave a link to the entire program in the video description below this video if you're interested in getting rid of your tight hip flexors for good and turning up the power on your swings, snatches, cleans, and presses, and so on. Incidentally, you might also be wondering, does this mean I should never brace my abs? And the answer is no, that is not the case, okay? You can brace your abs when you're doing a heavy, slow lift like a deadlift or something that requires a little bit more balance like the single leg contralateral kettlebell deadlift or something heavier like the squat or the press. But you should layer it, right? Layer, right? We can use those air quotes again. You layer it on after your deep abdominals are back online from restoring your anticipatory control. Okay, so again, restore anticipatory control, make sure that's working, then put a brace on top of that. Hope that makes sense. If you found this video helpful, click the like button smash the subscribe button, share it with a friend you know has got tight hip flexors and can't get rid of them or wants to get rid of them. Okay. And then leave me a comment in the comment section below. What have you done for your tight hip flexors? All right. What have you found the most beneficial? Until next time, my friend, stay strong.